Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for our Great Read program, presented in memory of John Boslow. As a reminder, everyone, if you could turn off your cell phones or put them on silent, that would be wonderful. Is this better? Sounds better to me. Fabulous. For those of you that don't know, my name is Natalie Lacey, and I'm the programs manager for the Aspen Writers Foundation. I'm delighted to have the honor of introducing Andrew Sean Greer tonight. Andrew joined us for Winter Words 2 years ago, and we're pleased to have him back to celebrate The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This autumn, when we were brainstorming ideas for events that focus on The Great Gatsby, Andrew came to mind immediately. Through our program, The Great Read, we encourage the entire community to join together and read one book at the same time. It is a dynamic way to celebrate a good story, and Andrew is one of our favorite storytellers. As he mentioned earlier today to students at Aspen High School, sometimes the best stories are inspired by other writers, and I know that Andrew has been inspired by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Tonight we have the pleasure of listening to his take on our Great Read selection, The Great Gatsby, and learning about the fascinating ways in which this book has played a role in Andrew's writing. I would like to thank the Aspen Community Foundation, the Thrift Shop of Aspen, for their support of The Great Read, as well as the staff of the Little Nell, Daniel Delano of the Hotel Lanedo, Aspen Skiing Company, Tom Anderson of Pomeroy Sports, and Les Dames d'Aspen for their support of tonight's event. Without further ado, I am pleased to welcome Andrew Sean Greer.
They're so lovely. Wow. Wow, the thrift store was a sponsor. I can't believe that. I went there today and I bought ski goggles, so I guess I just paid for my own trip in some way. And I would like to thank Pomeroy Sports because I have a conversion story to tell you, which was that last time I was here 2 years ago, I came as a snowboarder, and yes, and yesterday I became a skier. And I'm sorry for the snowboarders in the audience, although I suspect there are none. I just, it was one of those things that was like, why didn't I marry her all those years ago? I love her so much more. But you can't do that. You just have to go ahead. So my first day on skis was yesterday, so my second will be tomorrow. Can you all hear me? All right. It's working out. It's a great honor to be here, and it's flattering that they chose me to come and talk about The Great Gatsby. I should tell you that it's not my favorite thing to sit and lecture in front of people, which is why I was terrified today when on my schedule it said that I was going to talk to a high school for an hour and a half about The Great Gatsby, because I remember the jerks who came to our high school and talked for an hour and a half about books. And I was like, I guess he's sort of reborn as the most boring person you ever met. But, it went great. They were incredibly sharp. They had all read the book. They have lots of things to say. They had lots of questions about writers and about Gatsby. They had strong opinions. And so the hour and a half went by perfectly fine. So I think this will go just fine. I feel just to put you at ease. But there'll come a moment later when there'll be questions and answers. And I like that part so much more because then I can talk to you instead of feeling like that weird jerk. So feel free to, while your mind wanders and I talk, it could wander on the subject of what question you're going to ask. And that would be better. I have no clock or sense of time, so maybe someone could tell me when I should just be quiet and ask questions. Can you tell me when it's like time for questions or something like that? All right, I forgot my iPhone thing. Probably it's true of everyone that I read The Great Gatsby in high school for the first time, and I think I've only read it one time since then. And I have not brought with me my high school version of The Great Gatsby, but I was delighted to find this in my mom's house, her high school version of The Great Gatsby, in which is from, I think, it's got to be, it's a 1950 printing, but she must have been 1960. And she has taken pen and ink to the cover and made Gatsby in a bored English class into a kind of like, couldn't be a hippie. It has to be like a beatnik of the time. Yeah, isn't that amazing? So she's drawn, if you can sort of see, yeah, which I found incredibly charming. Also, her notes are so charming in here. You know, at the front it says, Gatsby, romantic belief in life, always have a chance, Western naivete, some God will always work things out. And you just think of like your 16-year-old mother writing that, and now she's grown so bitter. She's not grown bitter, no, but it's just so sweet in that little handwriting. And there's all these notes throughout that are like weather patterns and marking out Daisy. And then at a certain point, the notes stop. And I'm like, Mom, did you finish the book? You know? She was a bright woman and an English major for a certain while before she became a chemistry major. She had to choose between English and chemistry, she said, because she chose chemistry because she thought anybody could do chemistry, but that you had to really be a genius to be an English major. I'm glad I got a laugh because I have no idea what she's talking about. But when I first read The Great Gatsby, I think it was senior year of high school, I fell in love with it, and I think I fell in love with it for the reason a lot of some high schoolers in English do, because there's a passion to it that when you're that young, you know that there's something out there that's intense, that you can feel a connection to, but you haven't yet felt. And you read a book where someone feels it, and you're like, that's what I'm talking about. All the rest of you don't know anything about life, but this person does. It's about passion, right? And you're excited, you know, it's that kind of thing. I remember I loved the language of it, especially I found so beautiful. And I guess I understood the symbols and patterns in the book I found amazing in that way. And it's funny for, 20-something years to pass, and to reread it again and to have a different experience of it, which was, first of all, it's so short. Did anyone else find that? You're like, I didn't remember it being so short. I remembered it being weeks and weeks of like, now read the next 20 pages of The Great Gatsby, and you're like, but there's only 100, you know? Like, how many weeks could that have been? Which said something, you know, about how hard it is to read this book when you're a kid. But for me, I just found it, it's a quick read, it's so brisk, it's so fun. But also to look at it and realize, that passion I was so enthralled by as a kid, it's poisonous in some, having since experienced it, you're like, oh, no, there's it's too hot a fire to touch, being on the other side of it. The language also is not my favorite part of the book. My favorite part of it this time is the characters and the storytelling of it. I was so shocked by how maybe because I'm a professional writer now, but how quickly he could get the story going and how he could get it sort of intrigue the audience. And in a way, I thought, and I told this to the high school class, I said, I think it's a murder mystery, basically. Not to give the ending away, for those of you who haven't finished it, but there's a murder at the end. I know some people haven't finished it. And I thought, if it was Raymond Chandler telling this story, not exactly the same time period, but in a way, like sort of blousy blondes drinking too much and speakeasies and, big ruffian guys roughing them around, and then a gun comes out at the end. He would have told it with Gatsby's body at the beginning of the book, and then we would try to figure out how it had happened. And then it would be a noir thriller. But for Fitzgerald, it's told the other way around, that we start off with sort of, lovely Daisy powdered and sitting on a sofa all in white with the fabric floating everywhere. And it's not until the end that we get a dead body. And there's something about that it would be the same story as a murder mystery, but it's told in a different way. And it's a way that is focused more on character and language and less on the sort of thrill of the events. But I think part of the fun of the book, for me, and why it's a classic, is that it is still a page-turner. A high schooler wouldn't agree with me, probably. But there's something about it that's still like a well-told story, really well-crafted. the thing that most shocked me about it, reading this, was to realize how deep an influence it had on my own writing. Having not really read it in so long, I must have I read it over and over at the time, the way you do, and I think I just gobbled it up and digested it. It became part of my system, part of every cell, and then when I wrote my books, parts of it came out. And so I looked over, my last book is called The Story of a Marriage, and I just sort of looked over it and thought, well, let's see how Gatsby-esque it is. And I had told the students at the high school earlier today that I was not embarrassed to say that I like to steal from books, but I'm a little embarrassed to say I've stolen heavily from this one. Well, like, for instance, the beginning of The Great Gatsby. Not the first, it begins with a sort of an abstract sense that his father gives him, which isn't how I remembered the book. I was like, the book begins with, he gives someone directions in West Egg, and then Daisy's there. But it doesn't begin that way at all. It begins with his father giving this encomium about other people, and then a long history about his own family. I mean, just briefly, it says, my family have been prominent, well-to-do people in the middle western city for 3 generations. The Carraways are something of a clan, and we have tradition that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch. But the actual founder of my line were the grandfather's brother who came here in 1951, sent a substitute to the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries on today. Then he goes on, and he talks about how he comes to West Egg, and the decisions that his family has, and how he decides to come to the country. All given very quickly. Well, okay, here's the beginning of my book. Just a little bit. It's the same, what I want to point out is, it's the same sort of quick summary that gets you into the story. You would think that you would just start with the story. Any normal person would. But Fitzgerald and I both somehow decided we were going to start with something building up to the action. It's a woman telling the story, and the setting is like 1952. I was a teenager when I fell in love with Holland Cook. We grew up in the same farming community where there were plenty of boys to love. At that age, I was like those Amazonian frogs, bright green, oozing emotion from every pore, but I caught no one's eye. Other girls had boys falling all over them, and although I did my hair just like them and ripped the trim off attic dresses and sewed it on my hems, it did no good. My skin began to feel like clothing I had outgrown. I saw myself as tall and gawky, and as no one ever told me I was beautiful, neither my mother nor my disapproving father, I decided that I must be plain. So when a boy came along who actually met my eyes, who showed up along my walk from school and got himself invited in for a slice of bread, I didn't know what to make of him. I could tell he wanted something. For some reason, I thought it was help on his schoolwork, so I always went to great pains to hide my notebooks and not sit next to him in class. I wouldn't be used like a crib sheet. But of course, that wasn't what he wanted. He was always good in school. He never said what he wanted, in fact. Not in all the years I knew him, but you don't judge a man by what he says. You judge him by what he does. And one clear, bright night in May, when we walked by the strawberry patch, he held my hand all the way to Childress. That's all it took, just the briefest touch, in those days when I wore my nerves outside my skin like lace. And of course, I lost my heart. I was there with Holland in World War II. He loved that I talked like a book and not like any of the other girls. And when the time finally came for him to go into the army, I watched him step onto that bus and head to war. It was a lonely grief for a young girl. And then she heads to San Francisco, and then the actual story starts. But for me, I looked at that and I was like, well, I guess it's the same kind of technique, because I read differently now as a writer than I did as a reader. I read to steal things from the books I read. I am like the person you invite to your party who's actually like a cat burglar who's looking to be like, that is the cabinet that's got the good crystal. I read books and I do not finish them. I skim parts. I am looking for good writing and techniques that I can copy, and I attribute it, I tell people, where I got it from, but sometimes I don't even realize it, because I am always looking for the great way to tell some story or some interesting way to do it. And I think this I must have just brought into my system, that like you don't necessarily tell the story from the beginning. You have to have like a slow summary where the main character gives a version of their life, which is the version you give at a cocktail party. You know, he talks about, I had a Midwestern family, you know, my father gave me good advice. I thought I would go to New York. My family said it was okay. It seemed like a good idea to live in the country, which is, if you think about it, is nuts. Like, he's living in the Hamptons, right, in 1922. It's very strange. I bought a house. My friend disappeared. I got a dog. It ran away. And it turned out I lived near my cousin Daisy. Very quickly explained something that is a very weird situation, why a young man would not move into Manhattan, but would somehow find himself out in this other community where Fitzgerald needed him to be for the story to take place, for there to be a mansion, for there to be a body of water, with another mansion across it where Gatsby's old love lived, and for Nick to live next door. He had to figure out some way for all that to happen. But as a novelist, I'm like, oh, that is a tough situation, and he just wrote his way into it, and then he let it go, and you just believe that is a perfectly normal thing to do. And I've done the same here. Because I also saw that another technique that he used that I stole in The Great Gatsby is one of withholding information. Not only is there a lot of withholding of, you know, exactly who this Gatsby character is related to Daisy, and what's going on with Tom, but the biggest one is who this Gatsby character is. You know, you're sort of, is he a bootlegger? He's related to the Kaiser at one point? Someone has some theory about it. And then later on in the chapters, you get this sort of strange chapter where it starts about this time an ambitious young reporter from New York arrived one morning and asked him if he had anything to say. Anything to say about what? Inquired Gatsby. Why? Any statement to give out, which is, you know, very witty because it's a sort of empty newspaper question that he'd become this important person everyone was curious about. And if he had anything to say about anything, that would be fine. And then it goes on to say, really, here's the story of Gatsby, that he learned much later, but it's the time in the novel to tell you. The James Gatz, that was really, or at least legally, his name. He had changed it at the age of 17 at the specific moment that witnessed the beginning of his career when he saw Dan Cody's yacht drop anchor over the most insidious flat on Lake Superior. It was James Gatz who had been loafing along that beach that afternoon in a torn green jersey and a pair of canvas pants. But it was already Jay Gatsby who borrowed a rowboat and pulled out the Tuolumne and informed Cody that a wind might catch him and break him up in half an hour. So we get this chapter, which is sort of redoes our version of Gatsby. Or at least we finally get the answer, and in a way it helps us to have empathy towards him, because he seems like he's like just a nouveau riche bootlegger trying to win the charms of a woman who's totally above him. And then you hear his story and you have some sense that he was a desperate person, and in a sort of American type of a self-made Western, I think Ohio was seen as the West at this time, Western character, and sort of who sort of brought himself up by his own bootstraps and perhaps did some unsavory things, but it was all necessary. And I looked at my book, and I was like, well, I believe the same thing. I did the same thing. Because that part I just read you, where the character Pearlie, where she says, I met my husband, we grew up in the same community, and then he went to war, and then I came to San Francisco, and so on. She has, like Gatsby, or like the Nick's version of Gatsby that he tells you, she's left out actually the whole real story underneath. The way you do, like at a cocktail party, how'd you and your wife meet? Oh, we met at a party, and then we got married, and it was really fun, and they don't tell you, like, I was actually married to someone else at the time. Because then that's weird. It's weird, right? You know, someone else has to say, you know, he was married to someone else at the time. Or much later, when you're trapped in an elevator together, you're like, okay, I was married to someone else at the time. So this is the part. This is Pearlie telling the story about the same point in the novel where he tells Gatsby's real story about, you know, third or almost halfway through. And she's prompted by it by someone who comes to the house and confronts her about her husband's life. And she says, okay, I think you need to know this now to understand all of this stuff. It was the summer of 1943, and we were still in our teens. One afternoon, Holland's mother delivered his draft card to him on the front porch where we sat listening to the radio. Well, look at that, he said. He was a quiet boy. You could not make out what he thought of death. It could have been a stranger to him or terrified him to the core, but his mother, a tough, skinny widow, was well acquainted. She stated clearly, now, son, don't you sign it. This ain't our war. I won't lose you. Holland looked up at me with his square, beautiful face, and he took a sip from his tea, and then we could hear it, the ice clinking in his shaking hand. Poor, frightened young men being called off to battle, like townspeople watching a cyclone headed towards them, and you could feel it coming, the end of their youth. What do you think, Pearlie? He asked me. He dabbed a handkerchief across his forehead, which had darkened in the summer sun. Drops of sweat shone in his hair. Holland, do you remember my shocked silence? How I sat there in the rocking chair and said nothing. A bee was trapped in a lantern, buzzing like a bank alarm. We rocked back and forth to the radio, which was playing Don't Let Me Go of All Sad Things, and I finally got up the nerve to look over at you. Your beautiful face, your frightened hand. I knew what I wanted, but I had no idea if I had a right to want it, and I had no way of saying, don't go, I need you. What was my life without you? All I said was, oh. You stared at me and seemed to understand, and it was all we ever spoke about the matter. Holland chose, as men often have the luxury of choosing, to do nothing. His registration deadline came and went, and the brown paper stabbed with a rusted thumbtack above his bed grew blonde in the sun. His mother, knowing what it meant to let time pass, came into Holland's room one morning and, after pulling down the shade, ripped the registration form off the thumbtack. As she walked back out of the dimmed room, Holland sat up and asked what she was doing. I'm throwing it away, she said. But I was going to send it in, he told her. She stood in the hallway, wiping her hands on her flowered Hoover apron. She was a farmer's widow, used to saving what the world tried to take away. You can't send it in, she said. I'm going to. I already told the neighbors you left this Monday. You keep that shade down and stay upstairs. So you hear me? I've made up my mind. It's done. Without another word, she went downstairs, and he was left in his bedroom, darkened except for a shaft of light coming through the hole in the shade, dustily illuminating a pack of cards. Holland stared at the shade for a moment, and then he closed the door. How did you survive it? Your world was as cramped as a sailor's, just a sunless bedroom, a chamber pot, and 3 feet of hallway that could not be seen from the road. You were forbidden to go outside at all, to stand at the window or sing or bounce a ball against the wall. Forbidden, in other words, to be a boy. You were a monk, with your silence and the books I brought you, sequestered from the dangers of the outside world. How did you not break into pieces, knowing that if a neighbor caught sight of you by nightfall, the whole town would be there with yellow paint to pour over you and pots to bang in fury at a slacker like you? I know you studied every battle of that war, every ship of soldiers headed out across the Pacific and blown to smithereens. You kept track of figures and death tolls as any other boy would follow baseball statistics, and I know it was to touch the real world now and then, to have it hurt you, to feel alive. You lived behind the looking glass, in the hollow of a tree, in the deathless world that women had made for you. I visited that prison, wallpapered with newsprint. I arrived a few times a week with sheet music in my hand. His mother would sit downstairs alone, playing the bad piano I was meant to be learning, while I went up and visited her son. I always brought books hidden in my sheet music. I must have checked out everything in the library. And we would read together in silence or in whispers until it was time for me to step back in the strange, bright sunlight of a day that you never saw. We did our war dirty, his mother and I. Somehow on one set of ration stamps, she managed to run the farm without suspicion. She punched up oleo in a bag to make it look like butter and gathered milkweed pods for the ladies' auxiliary for soldiers' down vests. And I ordered a poster to hang in our window of a blue house with great letters. This is a V home. We salvage, conserve, and refuse to spread rumors. We did not merely act the part of citizens in war, all the better to hide our beloved boy. We were good people. We never doubted the need for mock apple pie so the boys could have real apples. And if he hadn't taken ill, my young husband might have lasted out the war. I sat by his dark bedside holding his volcano-hot hand, whispering to him to hold on, hold on. His mother, half demented from grief, constantly asking me, "What do we do, Pearlie? What do we do?" Until just before dawn I announced we had to fetch the doctor. The decision was all mine. It was not the doctor, though, who told. He was a kind, old-fashioned, whiskey-smelling man who stopped toothaches with melted rubber and sewed catgut stitches with the precision of his seamstress mother. It was the neighbors who heard him driving to the house that morning and saw a healthy old widow standing on the porch, motioning to help someone inside. Within 24 hours, the police were there with a draft officer, and Holland was pulled, still sweating from sickness, into a waiting Ford while I screamed from the living room window as if the nerves had been ripped out of me. In my mind, I'd killed him. "Did your mother make your do it, boy?" the draft officer asked Holland. He sat in a perfectly square little room with one long window. On its frosted glass, the shadow of a holly tree waved back and forth. "Oh, no," Holland told the man without looking at him. And then he pointed out it wasn't something he did. It was just something he neglected to do. His mother never said a word. Was it philosophical beliefs? Holland didn't know and wondered why he had to put anything. The man looked up at my young husband, and a terrible green reptile fury flashed over his features. "Boy, I can't put down that you're just a goddamn coward. I can't have that in my district. It don't mean you're not going to war." And then after making a few notes in his pad, he added, "I wouldn't come back here, boy." He was drafted after all and put on the army bus. His mother could barely look at him to say goodbye. She was so cocooned in grief and shame and the waste of it all. She gave him a kiss, and I gave him an old charm that he later lost in the ocean, a tarnished silver feather. I didn't know what else to give a boy headed to purgatory. He hung it around his neck and tried to smile as the military bus began to rumble, pulling away from me in our hometown. He never saw Kentucky again, or his mother, who died from a bad heart the following spring. He would never have seen me again if blind chance had not led me right by him on the beach. He never wrote in all those years. I mean, for me, when I look over that, it may not seem as similar to you. The language to me sounds awfully Fitzgerald. But most of all, it's in the book, it's a moment where the storyteller gives you the whole secret back history of someone that they would leave out at that cocktail party. To say like, "Oh, I met my husband, and then he went to war, and then we met again afterwards," and leave out the part where you actually hid him from the draft for months at a time. It's shameful, and you wouldn't want that to be known about your marriage. And in Gatsby, it's the same kind of thing where he withholds a lot of information that is shameful about people. You have this sense that something's going on that's bad between Tom and Daisy, but at first you're like, "Oh no, they're a happy married couple." Then you're like, "Oh, he's fooling around with some silly gas station attendant's wife." And then you hear they left the Midwest because he had some affair you never hear about at all. And then she seems like the biggest ninny in the world. And then by the end you realize they're actually belong together. The last scene we see of them is through the window, and he's looking in after everything's happened, eating fried chicken and having a beer, not champagne and oysters. And they're holding hands and they're talking. It says they're not happy, but they're not unhappy. And they talked in the tone of people who were conspiring together. And it's only after you hear all the stories of both of their lives where you sort of think, well, really, why bother with these people at all? They seem so romantic and exciting, but once you hear the story, you have empathy for them, you understand them, but you want, like Nick does, he wanted to, when he sees Tom again, he wants to punch his lights out, right? And I think I learned that from this book. And there's a part, when you hear of the death of Myrtle, of Mrs. Wilson, it's a very strangely told thing. I don't know if you noticed this. There's this long scene where it's wonderful, where Gatsby, and they're all in the hotel room, and the idea is that they're going to, first they all wanted to rent hotel rooms, each with a bathroom, so they all take baths. It's so hot. And then they're like, "Oh, let's just have mint juleps together," which is a terrible idea. And Gatsby confronts Tom way out in the open. He says, "Your wife never loved you. To Daisy, tell him, that you never loved him." And she says, "Of course not. How could I possibly?" And then by the end she says, of course I loved him. It would be untrue to say I didn't, but I loved you too. And he says, you love me too? I mean, that's such a heartbreaking moment for him. And after that scene, they switch cars and they drive back. And if you were telling this story to someone and say, like, okay, here's what happens in the book. They leave, and then Gatsby and Daisy's driving, and she hits this woman who runs out into the road, who thinks that it's Tom in the car because it's Tom's car. And then they keep driving, and then the other people show up, and they see her dead body, and they know what's happened, and Tom kind of conspires to get the husband to go after Gatsby with a gun. But that is not how it's told in the book. What happens is they leave the city, and the next paragraph begins something like, Mr. Michaelis, the Greek mechanic, would be an important witness at the inquest. He was working in his coffee shop. You go somewhere else entirely. So you get this sense something important has happened, but you're not told what. The body was found so-and-so. You're like, well, who got killed? And you realize it's Mrs. Wilson. You think, well, who killed her? And it takes forever to find out. He withholds all of this, and it's a kind of suspense because, it's a way to keep like something spring-loaded within the book at this moment to keep you wondering, if it was Raymond Chandler, you would be in that car going down the street, a white face would appear, and then you would hit it, and you would be like, well, who did we just kill? But instead, in Fitzgerald, you're with a Greek mechanic you've never met before who's at some inquest. And then there's like a black man in a yellow suit who they have to talk to, and they have to get everyone's name down. It's all told from some other direction. And it's that, the misdirection and withholding, I think I learned because I think it's beautiful. It's dealing with something that could be really melodramatic, is really melodramatic, and treating it in this sort of, like in Psycho in Hitchcock when Janet Leigh is dead in the shower. And you look everywhere in the room. I mean, if you walked in that room, you would look at the naked Janet Leigh bloody on the floor. But that is not what we look at in the camera. You look everywhere in the room, in the shower, and you look at the drain, you look at the towels, and then you go across, and then you move in on just her eye, right? Remember that? You just look straight in her eye. And that's the way to tell something that would be badly told by another director, is to sort of look at everything else that's going on. And to end, I think my question whenever I have writing crises, and I have them all the time, and I'm in the midst of one right now, is standing here before you, I'm about to have a nervous breakdown, the question is never in my mind is what am I going to tell? What is the story going to be? The question is always how am I going to tell it? That's always the problem. Because, any of you who tell stories to your friends or tell jokes of some kind, you know that really, you have to practice the joke. You're like, it's funny, but it's not working. No one's laughing, and you have to tell it in a new way, and finally you get it right, or sometimes you never get it right, but you still tell it because you think it's funny. It's like that. You keep trying to retell the story in some way until it works right, and it's the timing, the pacing, that kind of thing. And it's why I steal from books like this, because I'm trying to learn the way comedians steal their jokes from Milton Berle. And you're trying to learn the right way to tell it, because it's, you have to keep practicing on the audience. The audience is mostly you at home alone. And so the only other audience you could have is the other books on your shelves, so you pick those up. I noticed also that the end of Gatsby and the end of my book might be a little similar too, in this sense, which is that they, it ends not the way you would really expect. Like a lesser writer would say, like, when I think back on Gatsby now, I see mostly a man made of two parts, like blah, blah, blah. Instead, it's this very abstract paragraph that baffled high school students for almost 100 years now. And here you go. And as I sat there brooding on the old unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He'd come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He didn't know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgiastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning, so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. Whatever the hell that means, right? I mean, the orgiastic future, how many Snickers do you get in high school over that one? But it is, and the punctuation, you're not seeing it in front of me, but it is unbelievable. There is an M dash, we have ellipses, and we have the longest dash I've ever seen in my life. But it's beautiful, and what it's doing to me as a writer is it's taking it out of the story for a moment, and it's sort of taking flight, and it's changing into saying, we, right? We will run faster, not he or you or me, but trying to connect to the reader to some abstraction, saying the book's about you. I wrote it about you, actually, turns out, so pay attention. And it goes into this abstraction that you may have to reread to get a sense of what it could possibly be, the orgiastic future that year by year recedes before us. And one fine morning, the dash is like this long at the end of that. I've never seen that. Well, here's the end of mine. It goes awfully abstract. It won't give anything away because it's totally abstract. At the end of Story of a Marriage. Why did we do it, we ask of the man who runs off with his student and of the girl who breaks her engagement. Why didn't she? Luck was on their side, and fortune and happiness. For some reason, they stepped off the lovely precipice. It is not for just passion or beauty. These stories are everywhere, and few of us are beautiful. The balance tilts both rich and poor. It might be the folly of youth or the whims of old age, but madness does not discriminate. An old man about to marry at last might change his mind, his middle-aged children in the pews, and be unable to speak a reason. There is no reason. Why that old man in the chair sold off his family's property and fortune and legacy to be with someone else long ago, and why my husband at the last hour broke his promises and let opportunity vanish, no one would have guessed it. There is no reason. We cannot know, any of us, until the lunatic vision comes at last, that chances are few and we will die soon enough. The chains of obligation vanish. Take rapture if it's in your grasp, and take love if you can reach it. For Buzz, the love was Holland. For Holland, it was Sonny and me. Not madness. Perhaps in commonplace lives, our single act of poetry. Long dash. I wish I'd done that. Anyway, that's kind of all I have to say about Gatsby and myself for the moment. But I would now gladly maybe talk with you guys about it. If you have any questions or statements, you all have read Gatsby, I think. So I would be happy to entertain those. Yes.
Andy, would you mind repeating the question when it's asked?
Yes, I will repeat the question.
Thank
Good
you.
idea.
I like your comment on this. There's a literary theory that The Great Gatsby is not about Gatsby, and it's about America. And as part of the evidence, they say that the title he really wanted for the book was Under the Red, White, and Blue, but the book was already intended, and it couldn't be done. Do you think there's anything to that? Or what's your comment?
Well, this is a great question. It's a question about whether that there's a literary theory that The Great Gatsby is not about Gatsby at all, but about America. And in fact, that there was a talk that the title he really wanted was Under the Red, White, and Blue, but it was too late to change it. And it is a shocking thing when you look back at the book and you realize the beginning is about, it talks about America and the Midwest, and at the end he says, this book, let's see if I can find it. La la la. He says this is about the West. This book is about, I see now that this has been a story of the West. After all, we were all Westerners, and perhaps we possessed some deficiency in common which made us suitably unadaptable to Eastern life. That he points right to it, that this is a book about something else. About America, I would say, certainly. I mean, one would hope that any writer would hope that you're writing a book about small lives that really you're trying to write them as, without anyone noticing it, about America itself. I mean, it's hard for me to know because the book came out, it was written as a contemporary novel of its time, and now it's so, it's 90 years ago. It's so tempting now to look at it and say, like the students today, I wanted to tell them, like, so 1922, what was happening? And I'm sure they couldn't tell me. I mean, do you think? I'd be like, could women vote? Could you drink alcohol? But to see it as that moment of jazz age. But it is a type of people that was like newly invented. People with completely hidden pasts, with vast wealth, and intellectual, proclivities, who could invent themselves the way Gatsby did. I think that's why we keep reading it. Yeah. I love it. Oh, don't let that quiet you, because you don't have a literary theory, too. Oh, yes, hi.
Andy, what was if you can capsulize it, the reaction of the students to the book?
What was the reaction of the students?
90 years later.
90 years later, the reaction of the students to the book. Well, I was so scared to ask them, because I think it's terrible to ask students if they liked a book, and yet I asked them anyway, because you just want to know if they liked it. And I think those who liked it would be too shy to say so, because it would be super nerdy to like it, right? And one young woman, her comment was very typical, which was to say, I didn't like the characters, which is a very normal reaction to a book, and you want to say, like, well, life's not about that, really, and books sure aren't about it. And yet, she was the one who had the most comments to make about the book. I don't think she realized she liked the book. She had so many theories, she knew every part of it, she had so much to say, and yet she claimed she didn't like the book, because the characters were unlikable. But she had certainly not dismissed it for that reason. I think she hasn't quite reached the moment where she realizes that you don't have to do that, and that she's going to read a book called Lolita where she really doesn't like the characters, and she still likes the book, and she's going to be like, what is going on in my head? And she, she will realize that she gets to not like them. They all seemed, a lot of them seemed very much in the thrall of their teacher, who I think was a very good teacher, and looking at patterns in the book, which I think they were brilliant at finding. And I could tell that some of them wanted to be writers, but I couldn't quite see anyone with the sort of nerdy glint in their eye of like, wow, it's really cool. I don't think anyone thought it was cool. And I'm so curious how antique it seems to them, I just can't tell. Because to me, when I reread it, I was like, it doesn't seem stale. I think they seem really witty still to me. When even the first introduction of Daisy, when you have a whole paragraph about the room and the curtains flowing everywhere because there's a breeze going through, and it says the only stationary object was a sofa on which two young women were seated like on a balloon, and their clothes were floating around as if they had just taken a flight around the house. That's actually kind of funny. And the whole book is really, I think, witty and hasn't. But then, all I do is read old books, so I'm not a person to talk to about it. So I want to know if they thought it was funny, but I didn't dare ask. Yeah.
So it's a remarkable book. In 90 years, there's been a lot of remarkable books and fabulous writers. Why are we still reading The Great Gatsby, and why are we reading it?
It's been 90 years. There's been lots of fabulous books since then, so why are we still reading it? Well, couple answers. One, by the time he died in 1940, nobody knew who F. Scott Fitzgerald was. He was not famous. This book was not a hit when it came out, not at all as his other books, and it was done. So it only when it was reissued in the 50s for some reason that it became, and I think this always happens with writers, is that other writers were fans of his, and that it was reissued, and they all said, hey, have you heard this guy, F. Scott Fitzgerald? And then it came out again as a big hit. It happened in Melville. Nobody read that thing about a whale for like 50 years. It took like Edith Wharton to be like, I've read this very strange book that's like an opera in the middle of a Bible, And so that gives it a shorter timeline in a way. It gives it 60 years, right, of, from sometime in the 50s, which is when this beatnik version came out. And so why is it a classic? The cynical part of you would say, can you believe that English curriculum has not changed at all, in 50 years? That it's something lazy about it. But I think it's because it's such a compact, well, in terms of teaching it, it's such a compact way to show how books are made and how literature is told, because it has these patterns in it that are easy to show, of the eyes of T.J. Eckelberg that show up throughout, or you see certain colors through it. It has those things that if you haven't come across literature before, you would see. It's short. There's a gun in it. There's sex. There's cursing. I just think it's not a bore. It doesn't have to, because my students ask me, like, you like Great Gatsby, what other books would you recommend? And I was like, well, are you asking my favorite book? And they're like, yeah, what's your favorite book? And I was like, well, it's 6,000 pages long. It's by this French guy named Proust, and nothing happens in it for 4,000 pages. And they're like, why would you read that? I was like, let's not talk about that book yet. Let's talk about this one, because it's, to explain why someone would read something like that is impossible. But this one's more persuasive. Because the other way that a lot of English curriculum works is to try to give them something they'll love, because it's super pop, like teach Harry Potter because it's fun, and to try to get them to read books for that reason. But it'd be more wonderful because here's my theory about books like this. I was taught that there was a secret, it's a golden block in which is embedded a key to life itself, and if you were only smart enough, you would get into it and find it. And I am positive, now that I am a professional writer, that he wrote this because he thought you would think it was a hoot. That it doesn't have the secret to life, except by accident. That his main goal was to get you to turn pages and love every word of it. And I think he does such a good job in this one, because it gives me what I love about a book, which is that I need to be intellectually interested and emotionally engaged and reminded of the realities of my own life and shocked by recognition of the self. And also, I'd like to turn the page, and I like an author who will engage the storytelling part of it as well. And I'm convinced that was his goal, and that he was a smart guy, and part of making you turn the page was to get you to love the characters and love the language and those things too. And I think that's why it's a classic, is that he had our best interests at heart, as drunk as he was. Poor guy. Yeah, that's my long answer. Lisa. Sorry.
I would love to hear a little bit more about what you were saying earlier about writers picking up on a book that hasn't been really addressed for a long time. Do you think that is fairly common? Is there just a two-part question? Also, when it comes to initiatives like the Big Read, or the Great Read, we're calling it, if you think it has been successful, and if you think part of the success is attributable to writers like yourself who go on and create audio guides, etc., and how that community plays a part in restoring reading back to the heart of the culture of America and to reach lucky and last.
The question is about touching on other authors bringing up other books and bringing them sort of back to life as being in some ways more relevant today than when they came out, and also the project of the NEA in a lot of small towns that have these big reads or great reads where the whole town reads something together, where that is sort of crucial in bringing people back to reading and understanding the purpose of it in the middle of our culture. And I would say, yes, it's my doing. Yes, I did it. I'm here. I do this across America and save the world. Yes, of course. I think that it is. A book is a really funny thing because it is a not shared experience at its core. It is a private, individual experience that no one never has to know about in a way, and so it can die out and no one could ever know about it. It's not like you can look at theaters and be like, well, no one's going to see Spider-Man turn off the dark because we can see no one's in the audience. And so having something like, do you know what I'm talking about, right? Spider-Man? Something like the big read, you can get, it can be a shared experience, which is uncommon for a book. And you can sort of say, because I have to say in America, you wouldn't say that literature is at the center of our culture. You would say movies and TV are. That is the very center of what everyone talks about, which makes you sad in some ways. Because in France you would probably say food or something like that, which sounds a little more appealing, And it's a way to remind the country that actually, it used to be, and it still could be, and we could keep it there in some way because movies and TV don't quite do the same thing. You don't get to be inside the head of someone else. It's the only medium that does it. And I think it's why for young people, books are still, even though they drops away for them, it's still, they turn to them because they want to know what it's like to be a person. And it's really still the only way, before they come up with the most amazing video game in the world, Great Gatsby, the video game, you have to read the book to be what it's like to be in the mind of someone like Nick, who is trying to be in the mind of someone like Gatsby. And so it's still the only way in, so they can't die. But it's good for us all to be there to talk about it. Yeah.
One of my sons, about 2 years ago, said, "Mom, you have to read The Great Gatsby." I also hadn't read it since high school. And, of course, I read it because when your son says you have to read it.
You have to read a book, you have to read that book, yeah.
And I can't say that I can't remember how I felt about it when I was 16. But 2 years ago, I can't say I really liked it. And then I felt bad about myself, that I wasn't really liking the great American novel, and what was wrong with me.
Yeah, there's something wrong with you.
And then I tried to make up some theories about it, and one is that when someone, I don't know enough about the history of, the American novel to say first, but when the first person exposes something, the falseness or the emptiness of life, but then in the 90 years since, we know that in a myriad of ways, because so many other people have said it or done it, or, the Oprahization of America, where we know people who are not what they appear to be. And, personally, I'm a psychologist, so I see that all the time. So I tried to make up a story that I didn't like it so much anymore because I already know it.
Yeah. No, I think it's very interesting. She's saying, I'm doing this for the videotape, repeating it. Not because everyone here can hear you perfectly fine. It's a question about, her son asked her to reread The Great Gatsby, and she did, and she was surprised and a bit ashamed that she didn't like it that much. And she, as a psychologist, she made up a sort of a story about it, an explanation that perhaps when you see the first version of something, after there's been so many iterations of that thing, that it doesn't seem groundbreaking or earth-shattering because it's already been for so long that it just doesn't have the same surprise. I think that about this book, too. I was thinking, what I couldn't figure out, and I looked online, which is where every answer is found, and I couldn't figure out if it was shocking or if it was, all I knew is people didn't buy that many copies of it. But I think it's an interesting theory that, you read Edgar Allan Poe's murder mysteries about that murders in the Rue Morgue, and it's not that good, but it's the first murder mystery ever. And we certainly like the rest of them, but it's hard to really get your mind around the one. An ape did it, just so you know. I'm sorry, I gave it away. You're like, an ape did it? Please. But sometimes it's true. You have to kind of be like, okay, it's the first version. I have to admire the fact that he invented the detective, that in here he invented so much stuff. But you know what I also feel about books? It's It's personal. That's why I keep saying it's a not shared experience. Best thing about it, you don't have to finish it. You can skip parts of it, and you don't have to explain why you don't like it. and you don't explain why you do like it either. You know? I don't like Dostoevsky at all. And I don't have to tell you why. It's not my thing. I don't like cantaloupe either. It's like eating out of a human head, you know? It's not for me. I understand other people like it a lot. Yeah, I mean, also if you're a psychologist, you could be like, yeah, I know, honey, I'm sorry. You know. But how about the language, though, right? Okay, yes.
You talk about reading as being an individual, private, singular activity. And I'm wondering about writing. Do you feel isolated or lonely when you write?
Suddenly I felt like I was in a column of ice. Yeah.
And if so, does it bother you? And if so, what do you do?
I talked about reading as a solitary event, and do I think of writing as a solitary event? Is it lonely? Does it bother me? And what do I do about it? The other thing I have to say about books is that they're handmade objects made by one person, which is a rare thing to find. You know, that's the other thing I like about them, which is unusual. Because movies are made by committees, and TV shows are made by committees, and theater is made by groups of people. One person wrote it, but you can't, and operas and music, they all take other people to do them. But one person does this, and it has all kinds of flaws, like a piece of pottery or a painting. And it's amazing because of that. And I'm an amazing person because I make them. Yes, I can't tell you how solitary it is. I am a person, and most writers I know are people who can take a lot of solitude, who really like it, don't mind being, those women in medieval eras who didn't want to marry and they didn't want to till the fields, and so they were like, why don't you brick me up in a tower and just pass food through the door, and I'll just have visions of Christ for about 20 years. That sounds fine. Those women were pretty self-empowered women, that they could just sit there and think about Christ and just take food through the door. And I always admired them so much that they could leave society. And I think writers are like that. They're kind of weird, and they're happy to be locked away in a tower for long periods of time. I go away for 6 weeks at a time to residencies that invite me. And these days I go away for 2 or 3 days at a time to my mother's country house in Sonoma, California by myself, and, with a couple pizzas. But on the other hand, I do things like this because it's nice to have very social events where I don't. This is the fun part of it. Yeah. You know what? It's not the solitude that hurts. It's the actual writing that hurts. It is. That's the hard part is actually the sitting there, and the day before you were like, I am a genius. I don't know why they don't carve this in stone and put it in Washington, D.C., the thing I wrote. And then the next day you look at it and you're like, I don't know what was in the soup. I'm a fraud. They're never going to, I think 2 days ago, I actually was thinking, I have a friend who's a waiter in a restaurant. Maybe he could get me a job in that restaurant. Maybe I could, how am I going to make money? In the van right here, I was talking about, okay, I could set up a food cart. I could make little pot pies. I could be the pie guy, and I could sell them for $5 each. Well, I was trying to make a money scheme because the book I'm working on is such a disaster and I'm such a fraud, I'll never work again. And that happens every couple weeks. Yeah. Yes. Last one.
Even including your own work, that is in contemporary fiction, like in the last 10 years, say, that you think we might be reading 90 years hence?
Oh, my Lord. Is there something, including my own work? Did you hear what I just said about what a fraud I am? Are you here with me? You owe me a drink, young lady. But it's a very good question. It's one, is there anything that you think we'll still be reading 90 years from now? And it's a question the New York Times asked about 100 writers. I was one of them. What the great masterpiece of the last 25 years was. And it was so tough because, I mean, everyone knew what the right answer was, which was the ultimate answer, which was Beloved by Toni Morrison. But I'm not sure that's the book we'll be reading, honestly. I think it's a fantastic book. I think it's beautifully written, and it's about a part of history that was shocking to hear, but I'm not sure it's the one. The answer to me was the work of Philip Roth, but I can't point to the book of Philip Roth that we'll be reading, you know? American Pastoral, maybe? But like, parts of it are about glove making that are a little boring, you know? And other people were picking all this wild stuff. I think you can't see in your own time what's really happening and what's going to be, because you know, it's always famous, the bad reviews that great books get. And so for some reason, you would think that I would be able to see it, but I'm not looking at my contemporaries very much. I look to the past. You know, when people ask me about how to, you know, I'm looking for a book to read, give me advice, I'm like, my advice is if a book is still in print 40 years after it was written, you should read that book. And if a book came out last week and everyone's talking about it, you don't know anything about how good it is. It's, you know, the buzz will die down. My best advice to people is there's something called the New York Review of Books that republishes books that have been out of print, and they are recommended by authors who are like, oh, I found this book in this old bookstore, and you should really reprint it. I thought it was awesome. No one's ever heard of it. And those authors write an introduction, and every single one of those books is fantastic, and you've never heard of them. And every one could have been a classic, but somehow fell away. And that's depressing, in a way. But it's also heartening, like there's all these great books that still maybe mean more now. No one got them then. You know, the one that I recommend, NPR asked me a book recommendation. I said, A High Wind in Jamaica by Richard Hughes. It's about, anyone ever read that book? That is nuts. They made a movie. How dare they? I mean, it's about kids who are kidnapped by pirates, and the kids are more cruel than the pirates. And there's a scene at the end of it where the little girl is taken away from the pirates. And like, what a terrible, horrible thing that's happened to you. They're giving her a white crocodile, or baby crocodile, and she's in a ship, and she puts it in her nightgown, and she feels it crawling up inside her, and it looks at her, and it says, they stare at each other, the terrible creatures, for a long time. Alligators cannot be tamed. And you're like, ooh, God. I hope he didn't have children, you know? And at the very end, it was like, and they send the girl to a school, and she says, and the narrator says, and there Lucy went into the crowd of girls, you know, the girl who had been on this terrible adventure, and she stood among them, but if you could have told her apart from all the other ones, I would give you an award, because I sure couldn't. You're like, oh, God, they're all like that. Children are terrible. Anyway, it's a crazy book, but I couldn't believe it was still out there. So I can't look at contemporary books and tell you which one. You know, there's something out there, but it's not at all the one we're expecting. That's all I would say. Yeah. Anyway, thank you all for coming so much and letting me talk at such length about The Great Gatsby. And I'll be here right afterwards.
Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. If you haven't already done so, please grab a book from Explore Booksellers. Andy is available to sign his. And stay for a while. We have cheese and wine. And for more information on Great Gatsby, please visit our website, aspenwriters.org. Thanks.